I never told my arrogant stepfather I was a special forces colonel. I let him treat me like a useless, obedient daughter who worked a dead-end desk job. He loved to humiliate me at family dinners, mocking my modest paycheck while showing off his massive real estate fortune. But tonight, my highly encrypted phone lit up with a classified emergency code from my mother, paired with a live tracking pin from inside his fortified mansion. He thought I was just a quiet secretary. In 20 minutes, he was going to find out exactly what kind of monster he had awakened. My name is Blair, and I am 34 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to hide your true strength from a toxic family member until the absolute perfect moment to strike back. To anyone on the outside, my life looked incredibly mundane. Whenever my family asked what I did for a living, I told them I handled administrative logistics for the federal government. It was the perfect boring cover story. It stopped people from asking follow-up questions. My stepfather Vaughn Kingsley certainly never asked. A billionaire real estate mogul with an ego the size of a skyscraper, Vaughn only cared about people who could increase his net worth. He moved my mother Diane into his sprawling estate 10 years ago. From the moment I stepped foot in his house, he made it his personal mission to remind me of my place. He called me the freeloader, the charity case, and the invisible girl. During Thanksgiving dinners, he would pour $1,000 wine for his wealthy business partners and point at me sitting quietly at the end of the table. He would laugh and say that if I actually applied myself instead of pushing paper for a government bureaucracy, I might be able to afford a decent pair of shoes. I always kept my head down. I smiled politely. I let him believe his own delusions. The truth was entirely different. My boring administrative office was actually a subterranean bunker in Virginia. I am a lieutenant colonel in the Joint Special Operations Command. I command the Cyber Warfare and Special Intelligence Task Force. I spend my days dismantling international terror financing networks and tracking high-value targets across the globe. My clearance level is something Vaughn could not buy with all the real estate in the world. It was a freezing Tuesday night in January. A massive blizzard was battering the East Coast, dropping sheets of heavy white snow across the region. I was sitting at my command desk, bathed in the blue glow of tactical monitors, reviewing a classified dossier. The operations center hummed with the quiet intensity of dozens of analysts working in tandem. Then my personal phone vibrated. It was not my government-issued device, but a secondary burner phone I kept locked in a secure drawer. Only one person in the world had that number. I unlocked the screen. A single text message glowed against the dark background. 911-D. Below the text was a live GPS coordinate pinpointing the exact location of the master suite inside Vaughn Kingsley's estate. My blood ran completely cold. The air in my lungs vanished. 10 years ago, when my mother first married Vaughn, I noticed the subtle signs of his coercive control. The way he isolated her from her friends, the way he monitored her phone calls, the way he slowly drained her confidence until she was entirely dependent on him. Because of my training, I knew exactly how domestic abusers operated behind closed doors. I gave my mother a custom emergency beacon disguised as a simple designer keychain. I taught her a code. 911 meant an emergency. The letter D stood for direct threat to life. We agreed that if she ever sent that code, it meant she could not call the police. It meant she was trapped. It meant she was going to die. I stood up so fast my heavy office chair crashed backward onto the concrete floor. Specialist Carter, my lead tactical aide, immediately noticed the shift in my demeanor. He stepped away from his terminal and approached my desk. He asked if everything was all right and if I needed him to initiate a protocol. I did not answer him right away. I crouched down and pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner of the hidden safe beneath my desk. The heavy steel door clicked open. I reached inside and pulled out my customized Glock 19 sidearm. I checked the chamber, ensuring a round was loaded, and slammed a full magazine into the grip. I grabbed 2 spare magazines and slid them into the pockets of my heavy black tactical jacket. Specialist Carter watched me gear up with wide eyes. He knew I rarely deployed into the field myself anymore. I told him this was a personal situation and that I needed continuous satellite overwatch on the Kingsley estate, located 40 miles north of our current position. I ordered him to establish a secure comms link to my vehicle and monitor the perimeter of the property for private security contractors. Vaughn was a paranoid man. His estate was surrounded by 12-foot iron gates and patrolled by armed guards. He practically owned the local county sheriff who played golf with him every weekend. Calling the local authorities would be useless. The corrupt police would just call Vaughn to verify the situation, and whatever he was doing to my mother would be swept under the rug. I was the only one who could stop this. I threw on my tactical jacket and secured my weapon in its holster. I marched out of the command center, the heavy blast doors sealing behind me. When I stepped out into the night, the blizzard hit me like a physical blow. The wind howled, tearing through the parking lot and whipping snow into my face. I climbed into my blacked-out government SUV and hit the ignition. The powerful engine roared to life, slicing through the sound of the storm. I slammed the gear shift into drive and accelerated out of the secure compound, my tires gripping the icy pavement. The digital clock on my dashboard read 8:14 p.m. The drive to the Kingsley estate in normal conditions would take 40 minutes. Through a blinding winter storm, it would take much longer. But my mother did not have that kind of time. The encrypted beacon she triggered carried a silent timer. Whatever Vaughn was doing was escalating right now. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. For a decade, I had played the role of the quiet, obedient daughter. I had swallowed my pride to keep the peace. I had let Vaughn parade around his mansion thinking he was the most powerful man in the room. He thought he could do whatever he wanted to my mother behind those iron gates because nobody would ever dare to challenge him. I pressed my foot down hard on the accelerator, the heavy SUV tearing through the thick snow. He was wrong. He had absolutely no idea who I was, and in exactly 20 minutes, he was going to find out. The tires of my government SUV chewed through the accumulating snow. The wipers fought a losing battle against the heavy white sheets falling from the black sky. I pushed the engine harder, ignoring the warning lights flashing on my dashboard as the vehicle slid and corrected on the ice. Every second that ticked by felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. The secure comms unit embedded in my dashboard crackled to life. Specialist Carter's voice filled the cabin, crisp and urgent. "Colonel, I have satellite overwatch on the target location. Thermal imaging shows multiple heat signatures in the main living area, but there is an isolated signature in the upstairs master wing. That isolated signature had to be my mother." "Carter," I said, keeping my eyes locked on the treacherous winding road ahead. "Run a rapid financial diagnostic on Vaughn Kingsley. Do not stop there. Pull everything you can on his son-in-law, Dion. Dig deep into their corporate accounts." Dion was married to Sloane Vaughn's spoiled daughter. Sloane was the ultimate golden child, a woman who spent her days taking selfies at exclusive resorts and bragging about her perfect life. Dion fit perfectly into her fabricated reality. An African-American finance mogul with an Ivy League pedigree, Dion loved to wear custom-tailored suits and act like he was the smartest man in any room. He constantly offered me unsolicited financial advice at family gatherings, treating me like a pathetic charity case who barely knew how to balance a checkbook. There was a brief pause on the comms as Carter utilized our agency's backdoor access to global financial mainframes. The silence in the cabin was only broken by the howling wind and the roar of my engine. "Colonel, I am seeing major anomalies here." Carter reported, the tempo of his voice shifting. "Massive capital flight. We are talking about highly structured rapid-fire offshore wire transfers. They are routing through a labyrinth of shell companies in the Cayman Islands." "Are these Vaughn's corporate funds?" I asked, taking a sharp turn that sent the back end of my SUV sliding before the all-wheel drive caught the pavement. "No," Carter replied. "That is the disturbing part. The primary source of the capital is a series of private trusts. Specifically, trusts registered to your mother, Diane." My grip tightened on the steering wheel until my hands ached. Carter began listing the transactions. The amounts were staggering. hundreds of thousands of dollars moving in single synchronized bursts. Then he pulled up the recent expense reports connected to Dion and Sloan. Colonel Carter continued. The data shows that Dion and Sloan have been aggressively liquidating your mother's assets for the past 2 years. Those luxury vehicles, the designer wardrobes, the extensive European vacations they love to post online. None of it came from Dion's investment firm. His firm is practically insolvent. They have been funding their lavish lifestyle by systematically bleeding your mother dry. The sheer audacity of their deception made my blood boil. Sloan had spent the last 2 years putting on a theatrical performance for their social circle. She would post tearful videos talking about the heavy burden of taking care of her aging, sickly stepmother. She claimed she and Dion were graciously stepping up to manage my mother's affairs because I was too poor and too busy working my meaningless administrative job to help. They painted themselves as the wealthy, benevolent saviors of the family. In reality, they were parasites. They were using my mother as a personal ATM, draining the fortune my late biological father had left her. And now, based on the frantic velocity of these offshore transfers, Carter was tracking they were making their final move. They were liquidating the last of her massive trust. You do not move $50 million in the middle of the night during a blizzard unless you are planning to disappear or unless you are planning to cover up a murder. How much time until those offshore transfers clear? I demanded, burying the accelerator pedal to the floor. They are utilizing a delayed batching protocol to avoid triggering banking alarms, Carter explained. You have about 12 minutes before the funds hit international waters and vanish completely. That is all the time I need, I said. Keep the comms open and monitor local law enforcement channels. I reached the base of the private mountain road leading up to the Kingsley estate. The steep incline was covered in a thick layer of unplowed snow. I shifted the SUV into its lowest gear, forcing the heavy vehicle up the treacherous path. The engine whined in protest, but the military-grade tires found their purchase. Through the swirling whiteout conditions, the imposing structure of Vaughn's estate finally came into view. The property was a fortress. High stone walls flanked a massive set of wrought iron security gates. 2 private security cameras swiveled, tracking my approaching vehicle. The gates were locked tight, a heavy physical barrier designed to keep the world out and keep Vaughn's dark secrets safely locked inside. Under normal circumstances, a visitor would have to press the intercom, state their business, and wait for the guards to grant them entry. I did not have the luxury of time, and I had absolutely zero intention of asking for permission. I gripped the steering wheel tightly and braced my body against the seat. I did not hit the brakes, I hit the gas. The powerful engine roared as the heavy armored front end of my government SUV slammed straight into the center of the wrought iron gates. The metal buckled and shrieked under the massive impact, tearing free from the stone pillars in an explosion of sparks and shattered steel. I drove right over the wreckage, triggering a blaring security alarm that pierced the freezing night air. The heavy tires of my SUV crushed the twisted metal into the snow beneath me. I did not slow down until I reached the massive circular driveway at the front of the estate. The mansion loomed ahead of me, like a monument to Vaughn Kingsley's massive ego. Warm yellow light spilled from the floor to ceiling windows, painting the snowdrifts across the manicured lawn. I slammed the vehicle into park and stepped out into the howling blizzard. The freezing wind whipped my hair across my face, but I barely felt the cold. The heavy tactical jacket shielded me from the elements, and the adrenaline pumping through my veins provided all the heat I needed. The security alarms continued to wail, a high-pitched screech meant to terrify intruders. I was not an intruder. I was a daughter answering a distress call. I marched up the wide stone steps leading to the main entrance. The front of the house featured a pair of massive solid oak doors, reinforced with heavy iron hardware. Under normal circumstances, I would pick the lock or bypass the electronic keypad. Tonight, I had zero patience for subtlety. I planted my combat boot squarely against the center of the right door, right next to the locking mechanism. The sheer force of the tactical kick shattered the heavy deadbolt. The thick oak doors flew open with a violent crash, slamming against the interior walls. The transition from the raging blizzard outside to the opulent interior was jarring. The blaring security alarm cut off abruptly, likely disabled by someone inside the moment I breached the gate. I stepped into the grand foyer, shaking the snow from my jacket. The air inside smelled of expensive cologne, roasted meats, and aged wine. I walked past the marble entryway and into the massive formal living room. The scene before me was sickeningly perfect. A roaring fire crackled in the massive stone fireplace. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, inviting glow over the space. Vaughn, Sloane, and Dion were hosting a high-end wine tasting. About a dozen wealthy investors and business partners stood around the room holding delicate crystal glasses. A hired sommelier stood near a long mahogany table pouring expensive vintage red wine. The entire room froze the moment I entered. The lively chatter and polite laughter died instantly. The wealthy guests turned to stare at me in absolute shock. I must have looked like a nightmare walking out of the storm. My heavy black tactical boots were tracking snow across the pristine Persian rugs. My dark jacket dripped with melting ice. My eyes scanned the room with the clinical precision of a predator hunting its prey. I was looking for one person: my mother. I mapped every face in the room in less than 2 seconds. She was nowhere to be seen. Diane was missing from her own house while her husband and stepdaughter entertained high society. The silence in the room was finally broken by a sharp, mocking laugh. It came from Sloane. She stepped away from a group of investors wearing a designer silk dress that cost more than most people made in a month. Her hair was perfectly styled and her makeup was flawless. Wow. The invisible sister finally crawls out of her studio apartment, Sloane announced, her voice echoing loudly across the silent room. She turned to her guests with a theatrical sigh. "I am so sorry, everyone. This is my stepsister Blair. She has a bit of a flair for the dramatic. She usually stays hidden away working some boring government desk job, but I guess she smelled the expensive catering from across town." A few of the investors chuckled nervously, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to offend their wealthy hosts. Dion stepped up beside his wife. He looked exactly like the arrogant finance mogul he pretended to be. He wore a custom-tailored three-piece suit that hugged his athletic frame perfectly. He swirled the dark red wine in his glass, looking me up and down with an expression of pure disgust. "Need rent money, Blair?" Dion asked, his voice dripping with condescension. He took a slow sip of his wine before continuing. "Because if things are that tight, I can get you a job scrubbing the floors at my investment firm. The cleaning crew works night shifts, so you would not even have to talk to anyone. It would fit your antisocial personality perfectly." Sloane giggled, leaning into her husband's arm. The sheer arrogance radiating from the two of them was suffocating. They stood there performing for their wealthy audience, trying to humiliate me, using the exact same tactics they had used for the past 10 years. They expected me to lower my head. They expected me to shrink away in embarrassment or stumble over my words. They expected the quiet, obedient failure of a daughter to apologize for interrupting their very important evening. I did none of those things. I did not even look at them. I completely ignored their taunts. They were nothing but irrelevant noise. My focus remained entirely on the man standing at the center of the room. Vaughn Kingsley watched me approach with a look of mild amusement. He held his wineglass casually, his posture relaxed. He believed he was completely untouchable. I marched straight through the crowd of investors. They parted for me instinctively, sensing the dangerous energy radiating from my every step. I did not stop until I was standing directly in front of Vaughn. I stepped into his personal space, stopping mere inches from his chest. I looked up into his cold, calculating eyes. "Where is my mother?" I demanded. My voice was low, steady, and carried absolutely zero fear. Vaughn did not flinch. He looked down at me, a wicked, arrogant smirk spreading across his face. He found my defiance highly entertaining. He slowly raised his right hand, holding it up in the air beside his face. He did not answer my question. Instead, he simply snapped his fingers. The sharp sound of his fingers snapping echoed across the high, vaulted ceiling of the living room. Immediately, the heavy mahogany doors leading to the east wing swung open. Out of the dimly lit corridors, 4 massive men stepped into the warm light of the chandeliers. They moved with the synchronized precision of highly paid private military contractors. They were dressed in tailored dark suits that barely concealed the bulky tactical vests worn underneath. The distinctive bulge of shoulder holsters showed clearly beneath their suit jackets. Coiled, transparent earpieces wrapped tightly around their necks, disappearing behind their shirt collars. They did not walk. They marched. Within seconds, the 4 giants formed a tight, restrictive perimeter around me. They crossed their thick arms over their chests, staring down at me with absolute contempt. The wealthy investors in the room gasped and took several steps backward, giving the security team a wide berth. The hired sommelier quickly gathered his expensive wine bottles and retreated to the kitchen. I stood completely still inside the circle of muscle. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I kept my eyes locked directly on Vaughn. Vaughn swirled his wine with a theatrical sigh, shaking his head as if dealing with a disobedient toddler. He looked at the imposing guards and then back down at me. His arrogant smirk deepened into a full display of mockery. "Your mother is resting, Blair," he said, his voice dripping with fake paternal concern. "She had a very long day dealing with her medical treatments. The last thing she needs right now is her failure of a daughter barging in here, tracking snow across the carpets, and demanding attention. She specifically asked not to be disturbed, especially not by you." I knew it was a lie. The encrypted beacon from my mother was a direct plea for her life. But Vaughn was a master manipulator. He knew exactly how to spin a narrative to make himself look like the protective husband while painting me as the villain. He smoothly turned his back on me and faced his wealthy guests. He held his hands out in a gesture of helpless apology, playing the role of the burdened patriarch to absolute perfection. "I apologize for this unfortunate interruption, gentlemen," Vaughn announced, pitching his voice so everyone in the grand room could hear every single word. "Family can be such a heavy cross to bear. My wife Diane is a wonderful woman, but she carries a deep sorrow. She weeps constantly over Blair. It breaks my heart to see my wife cry late at night, devastated by the sheer mediocrity of her own flesh and blood." Sloane stepped forward, linking her arm through her father's. She put on a masterful display of fake sympathy, frowning at me as if I were a tragic accident. "It is true," Sloane chimed in, looking at the investors with wide, innocent eyes. "We have tried so hard to help her. We offered to pay for her to go back to school. We offered to get her therapy. But she just wants to stay stuck in her little administrative job, resenting us for our success. It is exhausting." Dion stood beside his wife, adjusting his expensive cufflinks with a self-satisfied grin. He looked around the room, shaking his head in mock pity. "We carry the weight of this family," Dion told the crowd, his deep voice resonating with fabricated authority. "Sloane and I work day and night to keep the Kingsley legacy alive and expanding. We manage the trust. We handle the investments. We ensure Diane receives the best care money can buy. And this is the gratitude we receive." A jealous, unstable sister crashing a private business event because she cannot stand to see us thrive. The investors murmured among themselves, casting judgmental glances in my direction. They were buying every single word of the toxic narrative. To them, I was exactly what Vaughn painted me to be: a bitter, broke, mentally unstable relative trying to extort her wealthy family. Vaughn turned back to me, his eyes shining with victorious cruelty. He had successfully humiliated me in front of his elite social circle. He had established his dominance. He thought he had completely neutralized the threat. "You are a disappointment, Blair," Vaughn said, his tone dropping its fake warmth and turning sharp as broken glass. "You bring nothing but shame to this family. You have embarrassed yourself enough for one night. Now you are going to turn around, walk out those broken doors, and drive your cheap government car back to whatever sad little apartment you came from. And if you ever try to pull a stunt like this again, I will have you locked in a psychiatric ward so fast your head will spin." I remained perfectly silent inside the ring of armed guards. I did not offer a defense. I did not scream or cry. I simply observed. My military training automatically kicked into high gear, calculating the physical threats surrounding me. The guard to my left was favoring his right knee, likely an old injury. The guard behind me was standing too close, throwing off his own center of gravity. The guard to my right had his suit jacket buttoned, which would delay his draw speed by at least a full second. They thought my silence was submission. They thought the heavy odds had finally broken my spirit. Vaughn gave a subtle nod to the lead security contractor, a massive man with a thick beard and a scar running down the side of his neck. The man cracked his knuckles and stepped directly into my personal space. He loomed over me, using his sheer physical size to try and force me into submission. The lead guard raised his massive arm and brought his heavy hand down hard on my shoulder. His fingers dug aggressively into my tactical jacket, applying a painful downward pressure meant to force me toward the exit. "Time to leave, little girl." The guard sneered, his hot breath washing over my face. I looked down at the heavy hand resting on my shoulder. Then I slowly raised my gaze to meet the guard's eyes. I did not blink. I did not breathe. All the feigned compliance, all the years of playing the quiet, invisible daughter evaporated in a single heartbeat. The mask was officially off. My eyes turned dead cold. My eyes turned dead cold. The lead guard expected me to shrink away from his heavy hand. He expected the natural flinch response of a terrified civilian. Instead, I moved with a sudden explosive violence that his brain could not process in time. In close quarters, combat speed is an illusion. Efficiency is what neutralizes a threat. I trapped his thick hand against my shoulder with my left arm locking his fingers firmly in place. I stepped sharply to the right, twisting my hips and driving my entire body weight downward. The sudden torque forced his elbow into an unnatural hyperextended angle. With a sharp upward strike of my right palm, I snapped the joint. A wet, sickening crunch echoed over the soft classical music playing in the background. The lead guard did not even have time to scream before I drove the heel of my boot straight down into his kneecap, sending him collapsing onto the pristine Persian rug. 2 seconds had passed. The guard directly behind me, the one who had made the tactical error of standing entirely too close, lunged forward to grab my waist. I did not turn around. I simply dropped my center of gravity and drove a devastating backward elbow straight into his throat. The strike was mathematically precise. I felt the cartilage of his trachea yield under the impact. He dropped to the floor, instantly clutching his neck and gasping for air, his face turning a deep shade of purple as he fought for oxygen. 4 seconds. The third guard stationed to my right completely panicked. His hand scrambled beneath his tailored suit jacket, reaching desperately for his shoulder holster. But just as I had calculated earlier, his buttoned jacket delayed his draw by a crucial fraction of a second. He was fumbling with the expensive fabric when I closed the distance between us. I grabbed the lapels of his suit, pulling him violently forward off balance, while simultaneously sweeping his legs out from under him. As he fell backwards into the heavy mahogany dining table, I drove my knee with pinpoint accuracy directly into his sternum. The impact cracked his ribs and knocked the air completely from his lungs, rendering him paralyzed on the floor. 6 seconds. The final guard, the massive man favoring his bad right knee, hesitated. That hesitation cost him everything. He reached for his weapon, but his eyes were wide with sudden terror, having just watched 3 highly trained military contractors dismantled by a woman half his size. I lunged forward, delivering a brutal oblique kick directly to his compromised right knee. The joint buckled completely, giving way with a loud mechanical pop. As his heavy body dropped, I delivered a precise open-handed palm strike to his jaw. His head snapped back, and his eyes rolled up into his skull. He hit the hardwood floor completely unconscious. 8 seconds. A heavy, suffocating silence crashed down over the grand living room. The only sounds were the ragged gasping of the guard with the crushed throat and the low, wet moans of the leader clutching his shattered arm. Then the absolute chaos erupted. The wealthy investors screamed, shoving each other out of the way as they scrambled toward the far walls, desperate to distance themselves from the sudden, extreme violence. Women in expensive evening gowns tripped over their designer heels. Men in custom suits knocked over cocktail tables, sending plates of catered appetizers crashing to the ground. Sloane stood absolutely frozen in place, her mouth hanging wide open in pure, unadulterated shock. The delicate crystal wine glass slipped from her perfectly manicured fingers. It hit the marble tile and shattered into 100 jagged pieces, sending a pool of expensive dark red wine bleeding across the white floor. Her pristine fabricated reality had just been violently ripped to shreds right in front of her eyes. Dion lost his sophisticated, polished facade in an instant. The calm, arrogant finance mogul disappeared, completely replaced by a terrified, frantic man backing away from me. He pointed a shaking finger in my direction, his chest heaving. "You are a psycho!" Dion yelled, his voice cracking with panic over the screams of the investors. "You belong in a psychiatric ward. You are completely insane, just like your mother. You belong locked up in a padded cell." I did not flinch at his words. I did not raise my voice to argue. I did not even turn my head to acknowledge his existence. Dion and Sloane were completely irrelevant to my operational objective. They were nothing but noise. I stepped right over the groaning bodies of the security contractors, my heavy combat boots leaving faint tracks of melted snow and spilled wine across the expensive flooring. I reached inside the chest holster of my tactical jacket. My fingers wrapped around the familiar textured grip of my Glock 19. I drew the weapon in one fluid, aggressive motion, lifting it from its holster and racking the slide with a sharp metallic clack that silenced the screaming investors instantly. The sound of a live firearm being chambered carried a universal language of absolute authority. The entire room went dead still, holding its collective breath. I did not point the weapon at Vaughn. I did not point it at Dion or Sloane. I raised the barrel and pointed it directly up the grand staircase, aiming the glowing tritium sights dead center at the locked door of the upstairs master suite. I aimed the glowing tritium sights dead center at the locked door of the upstairs master suite. I did not hesitate. I squeezed the trigger twice in rapid succession. The deafening cracks of the 9mm rounds echoed like thunder through the cavernous mansion. The wealthy guests below screamed again, burying their heads into the floor, but I was already moving. The heavy brass locking mechanism of the master suite shattered under the ballistic impact, sending splintered wood and twisted metal flying inward. I drove my combat boot into the center of the door, kicking it wide open. I swept the barrel of my weapon across the darkened room, slicing through the shadows with clinical precision. The master suite was massive, featuring vaulted ceilings and expensive silk drapery, but the air inside was thick and heavy. It smelled distinctly of clinical antiseptics, stale sweat, and something metallic. I found her in the far corner of the room, near the heavily curtained windows. My mother Diane was slumped sideways in a heavy-duty medical wheelchair. Thick leather restraint straps bound her wrists and ankles tightly to the metal frame, digging violently into her frail skin. Her head hung at an unnatural angle, her breathing shallow and ragged. I rushed forward, holstering my weapon and dropping to one knee beside her. "Mom," I said, my voice tight, as I reached out to touch her cheek. Her skin was ice-cold and clammy. She barely reacted to my touch. Her eyes fluttered open, but they were completely glazed over, unfocused and swimming in a heavy chemical fog. They had pumped her full of high-dose medical-grade sedatives. Her pupils were pinpoint size and her jaw hung slack. I checked her pulse, pressing 2 fingers against her neck. It was dangerously sluggish. A small plastic designer keychain, the emergency beacon I had given her a decade ago, lay discarded on the floor near the wheel of the chair. She had managed to press it just before the drugs completely shut down her nervous system. I worked frantically at the thick leather straps binding her wrists. As I pulled the heavy buckles loose, I noticed the dark purple bruising wrapping around her forearms. She had fought them. She had fought them as hard as her frail body would allow. My eyes darted across the dim room, scanning for the medication they had used. That was when I saw it. Sitting perfectly centered on the solid mahogany nightstand, illuminated by a single brass reading lamp, was a crisp stack of legal documents. I left my mother's side for a split second and stepped over to the nightstand. I picked up the heavy parchment paper. The bold black letters at the top of the first page read, "Durable power of attorney and absolute trust transfer." My military training allowed me to speed read the dense legal jargon in a matter of seconds. The document outlined the immediate and irrevocable transfer of Diane Kingsley's entire financial estate. It completely dissolved her $50 million private trust. Every single cent of the fortune my biological father had left her was being legally redirected to a corporate holding account managed exclusively by Dion's offshore investment firm. They were not just bleeding her dry slowly anymore, they were taking the entire vault in one massive sweeping strike. I flipped to the final page of the document. The signature line was filled out. Diane's name was scrawled across the dotted line in a jagged, chaotic mess of ink. It was the desperate, forced handwriting of a woman fighting against heavy sedatives and physical coercion. But it was not the signature that made my blood run cold. It was what sat directly next to it. Just inches from the ink, right on the edge of the crisp white paper, was a distinct fresh smear of dark red blood. I looked back at my mother. I noticed the small jagged cut on her lower lip and the fresh crimson stain on the collar of her silk nightgown. Vaughn had not just coerced her, he had physically struck her to force her to sign the document before the sedatives completely paralyzed her motor functions. A dark, lethal rage ignited deep inside my chest. It was a cold, calculating fury that stripped away any remaining ounce of mercy I might have held for the people in this house. I carefully folded the blood-stained legal document and secured it inside the inner waterproof pocket of my tactical vest. It was no longer just a financial transfer. It was physical evidence of felony elder abuse and extortion. I drew my Glock, once again the textured grip grounding me to the reality of the mission. I needed to get my mother out of this house and into the hands of a trusted military medical team. I stepped out of the master suite and moved back to the edge of the grand staircase, looking down into the foyer. The chaos below had subsided into an eerie, tense silence. The wealthy investors were huddled together in the far corners of the living room, too terrified to make a sound. The 4 private security contractors were still groaning on the floor, nursing their shattered joints and broken bones. Standing at the very bottom of the grand staircase, perfectly centered in the foyer, was Vaughn Kingsley. He was not hiding. He was not cowering like Dion or Sloane. He was standing tall, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive tailored suit. He looked up at me, standing at the top of his stairs, with a weapon drawn. Vaughn was not panicking. He was smiling. It was a wicked, arrogant smile full of absolute venom and supreme overconfidence. In his right hand, he held his cell phone, its screen glowing brightly in the dim foyer light. "You just committed armed home invasion and assault," Vaughn called out, his voice echoing up the staircase, dripping with smug satisfaction. "You fired a weapon inside my home. You broke my security team. You ruined my evening." He took a slow, deliberate step toward the bottom stair, waving the glowing cell phone in the air. "You think your little tactical gear makes you powerful, Blair," he sneered. "You think you can just walk in here and take what is mine. You are nothing. You are a poor, psychotic little girl who just signed her own life away." The county sheriff is already pulling into the driveway. Red and blue emergency lights suddenly painted the snow-covered lawn, flashing violently through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the grand living room. Because I had already kicked the front doors off their hinges, the local authorities did not even have to knock. They swarmed into the grand foyer like a tactical strike team. Heavy combat boots crunched over the splintered oak and shattered glass. Sheriff Tate led the charge. I recognized his face immediately from the background intelligence files Specialist Carter had compiled. He was a corrupt local official who spent every other Sunday drinking expensive scotch on Vaughn's private golf course. Right behind him were 4 armed county deputies. They swept their service weapons across the room, taking in the sight of the 4 highly trained security contractors groaning on the floor. Then their weapons all snapped upward, pointing directly at my chest. "Drop the weapon right now!" the sheriff roared, his voice booming over the chaos. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The moment the police entered, Vaughn executed a flawless theatrical performance. The smug, arrogant billionaire vanished in a fraction of a second. He dropped his cell phone, letting it clatter to the marble floor, and threw his hands up defensively. He shrank back against the wall, adopting the posture of a terrified, helpless victim. Sheriff, thank God you arrived. Vaughn shouted, his voice trembling with fabricated panic. She is completely out of her mind. She broke into our home and started attacking everyone. She is trying to kill us. I stood at the top of the grand staircase, my Glock 19 still resting firmly in my grip. I looked down the barrel at the 5 law enforcement officers aiming their weapons at me. I did not panic. I simply ran a rapid tactical calculation. 5 armed hostiles. Close proximity. Engaging them would result in a lethal shootout. I was a high-ranking federal military officer, and gunning down local deputies, no matter how corrupt their boss was, went against every operational protocol. It would compromise the entire mission and put my mother in the crossfire. Before the sheriff could shout another command, Dion stepped out from the crowd of terrified investors. He had completely recovered from his earlier panic. The presence of the corrupt police emboldened him. He smoothed the lapels of his custom-tailored suit and adopted his polished Ivy League finance mogul persona. He moved toward the sheriff with smooth, calculated confidence, acting as the voice of wealthy, sophisticated reason. "Sheriff Tate, thank you for your rapid response," Dion said, his deep voice resonating with false authority. "I am Dion Kingsley, the family's financial director and Vaughn's son-in-law. Please understand you are dealing with a highly volatile psychiatric situation here." Dion reached inside his suit jacket, moving slowly so the deputies would not panic. He pulled out a crisp manila folder and handed it directly to the sheriff. "My mother-in-law, Diane, is suffering from end-stage Alzheimer's disease," Dion explained. His face twisted into a mask of deep, tragic sorrow. "She had a severe clinical episode tonight and unfortunately hurt herself in her confusion. We had to secure her upstairs for her own medical safety while we waited for a private ambulance." He gestured vaguely up the stairs toward me. "But her daughter Blair here has a long documented history of severe psychological issues," Dion continued, shaking his head in mock pity. "She has always been bitterly jealous of our financial success. She works a dead-end government admin job and resents everything we have built. She burst in here tonight in a violent, delusional rage. She shot the locks off the doors and started assaulting our security team. She is trying to extort us for her mother's trust fund." Sloane seized the opportunity to join the performance. She rushed to Dion's side, burying her face in his shoulder and sobbing hysterically. She pointed a gun at my father. Sloane cried out, her voice shaking with fake terror. She said she was going to execute all of us if we did not wire millions of dollars into her bank account. "Please, officer, do not let her hurt my family." The sheriff did not even bother opening the manila folder Dion handed him. He did not need to read the fake medical records. He was already bought and paid for by Vaughn's real estate empire. He looked up at me, his eyes narrowing with aggressive authority. "You heard the man," the sheriff shouted, aiming his weapon directly at my head. "Put the firearm on the ground right now or we will use lethal force. This is your last warning." I stood perfectly still. I looked at Dion, who was staring back at me with a sickening, victorious smirk. He genuinely believed his expensive suit and his polished vocabulary had outsmarted me. He believed his fabricated narrative had trapped me in a corner. He thought I was just a desperate poor sister who had let her emotions ruin her life. He was incredibly wrong. In intelligence warfare, letting the enemy believe they have won is often the most effective way to spring the final trap. If I fought back now, they could shoot me and claim self-defense. If I surrendered, they would move forward with their plan to wire the $50 million offshore, thinking the threat was entirely neutralized. They would walk blindly right into the digital snare my cyber command center was currently wrapping around their entire financial existence. I locked eyes with Vaughn, reading the absolute triumph radiating from his face. Then I slowly bent my knees. I kept my movements deliberate and non-threatening. I placed my custom Glock 19 onto the carpet at the top of the stairs. I stood back up and raised my empty hands high into the cold air. "Move," the sheriff barked to his deputies. "Secure the suspect." 3 deputies rushed heavily up the grand staircase. They did not treat me gently. One grabbed me by the shoulder and slammed me hard against the wall, pinning my face against the expensive wallpaper. Another wrenched my arms violently behind my back. I did not resist. I let my muscles go completely slack, playing the role of the defeated broken daughter to absolute perfection. The cold, heavy steel of the police handcuffs bit harshly into my wrists. The ratchet mechanism clicked loudly as they secured the restraints, locking my hands together behind my back. The deputies shoved me roughly down the grand staircase, my combat boots thudding heavily against the mahogany steps. They forced me to stand in the center of the foyer, surrounded by the wreckage of the front doors. Now that I was physically restrained and seemingly neutralized, the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The fake terror evaporated from Vaughn's face, replaced by a look of profound, victorious cruelty. He stepped closer to me, smoothing his expensive tie. "Thank you, deputies," Vaughn said, his voice returning to its normal, arrogant cadence. "You have saved my family from a very dangerous woman. I will be sure to mention your bravery to the mayor at the country club tomorrow." Sloane, seeing that the physical threat was gone, dropped her crying act entirely. She walked right up to me, her designer heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She crossed her arms and looked me up and down with absolute disgust. "You really thought you could come in here and play the hero?" Sloane sneered, her voice loud enough for the deputies to hear. "You are pathetic, Blair. You have always been pathetic. You sit in your tiny apartment clipping coupons and pretending you are morally superior to us. It is exhausting dealing with a crazy broke sister who cannot handle her own failures. Mom is sick and we are the only ones taking care of her while you throw violent tantrums." She turned to the sheriff, flashing him a dazzling, appreciative smile. "I hope you lock her away for a very long time," Sheriff Sloane said sweetly. "She needs serious psychiatric help." Dion moved in next, standing so close I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. He leaned in ostensibly to check if I was securely handcuffed, but he lowered his voice so only I could hear his venomous whisper. "You lose, little girl," Dion hissed directly into my ear. "You thought you could outsmart me, but you are going to rot in a holding cell tonight. While you are sitting on a concrete bench, I am going to execute the offshore wire transfer. I am going to buy a brand new yacht with your mother's trust fund, and I might even name it after you." I did not pull away from him. I did not struggle against the heavy steel cuffs biting into my wrists. I looked Dion dead in the eyes and smiled. It was a cold, predatory smile that made him involuntarily take a half step backward. He expected me to be screaming or crying. My absolute calm terrified him. I turned my attention entirely away from Dion, focusing directly on the corrupt sheriff, who was currently writing down my physical description on a notepad. "Sheriff Tate," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the quiet foyer. "Before you book me into the county jail, you are required by federal law to officially scan my primary identification." The sheriff looked up from his notepad, scoffing loudly. He walked over to me, shaking his head in mock pity. "I know who you are, lady," the sheriff grunted. "You are Vaughn Kingsley's crazy stepdaughter. I do not need to scan your ID to know you are going to be facing a judge for armed home invasion." "It is not a request, Sheriff," I stated firmly, locking my eyes onto his. "It is federal protocol. My identification is in the left breast pocket of my tactical jacket. If you transport me without scanning it, your entire department will be facing a federal obstruction charge by morning." Vaughn laughed, a harsh, booming sound that echoed through the room. "Listen to her," Vaughn mocked, gesturing toward me. "She thinks she is a lawyer now. Just book her, Sheriff. She is delusional." The sheriff rolled his eyes, visibly annoyed by my persistence. He clearly just wanted to process the arrest and get back to pleasing his wealthy benefactor. But my unwavering confidence and the specific mention of federal charges made him hesitate just enough. "Fine," the sheriff muttered, stepping closer. "Let us see this very important ID." He reached roughly into the left pocket of my tactical jacket. His thick fingers fumbled for a second before he pulled out a solid black polycarbonate card. It did not look like a standard driver's license. It had no state seal, no brightly colored background, and no home address. It was completely matte black, featuring a minimalist magnetic strip, a complex microchip, and a stark high-definition photograph of my face. The sheriff frowned, staring down at the unmarked military identification card. He looked confused by its heavy weight and lack of standard civilian markings. He pulled a mobile dispatch scanner from his utility belt, a device linked directly to state and federal databases. With an exasperated sigh, the sheriff swiped the barcode of my black ID card through his mobile scanner, expecting a routine error message or a standard civilian profile to pop up. The scanner emitted a sharp, piercing tone. It was not the standard dull beep of a rejected civilian license or a routine processing error. This sound was a high-frequency digital alert that cut through the tense atmosphere of the grand foyer like a siren. The small screen of the mobile device flickered violently in the palm of his hand. The standard blue and white interface of the county dispatch system vanished entirely. The screen went pitch black for a fraction of a second before erupting into a blinding fluorescent red. Vaughn crossed his arms, huffing in deep annoyance. He believed it was merely a technical glitch. He ordered the sheriff to stop wasting time playing with broken equipment and to just drag me out to the squad car. But the sheriff did not move. He was staring down at the device like it had suddenly turned into a live explosive. Bold, stark white letters began scrolling rapidly across the violently red background of the scanner. The text was unmistakable. Top secret, DoD clearance level 9. Echelon protocol active. The sheriff tapped the screen frantically, trying to close the window. He pressed the physical home button on the device. He held down the power switch, trying to force a hard reset. Nothing happened. The device was completely bricked, locked out, and commandeered by a military mainframe hundreds of miles away. My cyber warfare team back at the subterranean bunker in Virginia was actively monitoring my operational status. Specialist Carter had received an automated digital ping the exact millisecond a local law enforcement database attempted to query my classified credentials. He had immediately hijacked the county system, throwing a digital net over their entire network. Dion stepped forward, his polished finance mogul persona slipping into raw irritation. He demanded to know what the holdup was. Sloane complained loudly that her feet hurt from standing in designer heels and that she wanted me removed from her pristine house immediately. Before the sheriff could formulate a response to their arrogant whining, a new sound pierced the tension in the room. It was a cell phone ringing. It was not the standard police radio clipped to his tactical vest. It was his personal cell phone secured tightly in his breast pocket. The sheriff pulled the phone out, his thick brow furrowing in deep confusion. He looked at the caller ID. The screen displayed a Washington, D.C. area code followed by a string of zeros indicating a highly secured government trunk line. He swiped to answer, pressing the phone to his ear with a gruff, authoritative tone. Sheriff Tate speaking. I watched the exact moment his entire reality shattered. It happened in agonizing slow motion. The booming voice on the other end of the line was a harsh military bark, carrying a frequency of absolute command. It was a 3-star general from the Pentagon. I knew this because my protocol dictated that any local law enforcement interference with my operational status triggered an immediate escalation to the highest available commanding officer on the East Coast. The sheriff went completely rigid, his spine snapped perfectly straight. The arrogant local cop who thought he owned this county, who drank expensive scotch with corrupt billionaires, was suddenly reduced to a trembling subordinate. "Yes, sir," the sheriff said, his voice losing all of its previous bravado. It came out as a weak, raspy whisper. The voice on the other end of the line barked another command, sharp and unforgiving. The cadence of the general's reprimand was so aggressive that even Vaughn, standing several feet away, stopped complaining and stared at the sheriff in absolute confusion. The color physically drained from the sheriff's face. The ruddy, flushed complexion of a man entirely too comfortable with his own local power vanished. His skin turned a sickly ashen gray. He looked up from the floor and locked eyes with me. The aggressive authority in his gaze was completely erased, replaced by naked, unadulterated horror. I was standing there with my hands bound tightly behind my back, surrounded by his armed deputies. But the sheriff suddenly realized he was the one in mortal danger. He realized he had just authorized his men to lay hands on a high-ranking federal military commander operating under a classified directive. "I did not know, sir," the sheriff stammered, sweat beading rapidly along his hairline. "We received a call from the homeowner. We just responded to a standard home invasion. I had no idea who she was." The voice on the phone cut him off brutally, slicing through his pathetic excuses. Yes, General. The sheriff breathed, his chest heaving as he fought for air. Immediate release. Understood, sir. Vaughn stepped forward, his face twisted into a scowl of pure entitlement. He demanded to know who was on the phone. He reminded the sheriff of his massive campaign contributions. He ordered him to hang up and do his job. The sheriff did not even acknowledge Vaughn. He was entirely focused on the voice of the man who could end his career, his freedom, and his life with a single signature. No, sir, the sheriff said, his hand gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned stark white. I will not interfere. We are standing down immediately. Yes, sir. Have a good evening, sir. The call disconnected. The sheriff slowly lowered the phone from his ear. His hand was trembling so violently he could barely maintain his grip on the device. He tried to clip his heavy police radio back onto his tactical belt, but his motor skills were completely failing him. The radio slipped through his shaking fingers and hit the solid marble floor of the foyer with a loud, sharp crack. The plastic casing splintered, but he did not bend down to retrieve it. He simply left it lying in the spilled wine and melted snow. Sheriff, what is the meaning of this? Vaughn roared, his patience entirely exhausted. I gave you a direct order to remove this psychotic woman from my property. Arrest her right now. The sheriff ignored the billionaire completely. He walked slowly toward me, his heavy boots hesitant and dragging. Every step he took was laced with sheer terror. His deputies exchanged nervous, confused glances, gripping their weapons but unsure of what to do next. Their commanding officer had just been mentally broken in front of them in less than 60 seconds. The sheriff stopped directly in front of me. He avoided making eye contact. He looked down at my heavy steel handcuffs. He reached to his duty belt and fumbled for his keys. The metal rings jingled loudly, betraying how badly his hands were shaking. He slid the small key into the locking mechanism of the cuffs. With 2 quick clicks, the heavy steel restraints fell away from my wrists, hitting the marble floor with a heavy metallic clang. I slowly brought my arms forward, rubbing the deep red indentations on my skin. I rolled my shoulders, stretching the muscles in my upper back. I did not say a single word. I simply watched him. The sheriff took 3 rapid steps backward, putting immediate distance between us. He held his hands up open and empty, showing absolute submission. He continued backing away, retreating toward his deputies, his eyes wide with sheer terror. The heavy steel handcuffs lay on the marble floor, reflecting the red and blue emergency lights flashing through the front windows. Sheriff Tate kept backing away until he bumped into one of his own deputies. He waved his hand frantically, signaling his men to lower their weapons and fall back immediately. The deputies, confused but deeply relieved to be out of the crossfire, holstered their sidearms and retreated toward the shattered oak doors. Sloane broke the heavy, suffocating silence. Her voice was shrill and frantic, echoing off the crystal chandeliers overhead. She lunged forward, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at the retreating law enforcement officers. "What are you doing?" Sloane screamed, her face turning an ugly mottled red. "You cannot leave. She attacked our security team. She pointed a gun at my father. You work for us. My father pays your salary and funds your campaigns. Put those cuffs back on her right now." The sheriff did not even look at Sloane. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the floor, stepping backward through the ruined entryway and disappearing into the freezing blizzard outside. His deputies scrambled out right behind him, leaving the wealthy elite completely defenseless in their own home. I slowly rubbed my wrists, working the circulation back into my hands. I reached up and adjusted the collar of my tactical jacket, smoothing the heavy weather-resistant fabric. I rolled my shoulders, releasing the tension from the brief physical altercation with the security guards. The shift in the room was palpable. The air grew heavy, pressing the arrogance right out of the billionaires and their wealthy investors. They finally understood that the local authorities were not coming to save them. The safety net of their immense wealth had just evaporated. I turned my gaze away from the empty doorway and stared Vaughn dead in the eyes. "Colonel Blair," I announced, my voice ringing out with absolute military authority, "commander of the Joint Cyber Warfare and Special Intelligence Task Force." I took a slow, deliberate step toward him, closing the distance. "Thanks for keeping my mother warm, Vaughn," I said, my tone laced with lethal ice. The realization hit the room like a physical shockwave. I watched the meticulously constructed reality of the Kingsley family shatter into a million jagged pieces right in front of my eyes. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. For 10 years, they had mocked me. They had created an entire fictional narrative about my life to make themselves feel vastly superior. They called me the invisible sister. They called me the loser secretary. I remembered sitting at their lavish Thanksgiving dinners listening to them joke about my modest clothes and my dead-end administrative job. I remembered Dion tossing me a $20 bill for a cab and telling me to invest it wisely. I remembered Sloane offering me her cast-off designer bags because she pitied my lack of style. They had spent a decade treating me like a peasant who was lucky to even be allowed inside their mansion. They had absolutely no idea that while they were taking selfies on rented yachts and buying custom-tailored suits, I was sitting in a highly classified subterranean bunker directing global intelligence operations. They had no idea that the quiet, obedient daughter they bullied had the authority to mobilize federal strike teams and command generals at the Pentagon. Sloane stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the edge of the thick Persian rug. She grabbed Dion's arm to steady herself, gasping for air, as if she was suddenly suffocating. The golden child who had built her entire identity on being infinitely better than her stepsister suddenly realized she was nothing but a fragile insect standing in the shadow of an apex predator. Dion swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his expensive silk tie. The polished finance mogul recognized the specific words I had just spoken: cyber warfare, special intelligence. As an investment banker, Dion understood exactly what kind of access and absolute power those military divisions commanded. He realized that the woman he had just threatened with a holding cell had the capability to erase his entire digital existence with a single keystroke. His arrogance dissolved instantly into raw, unadulterated terror. But Vaughn Kingsley was an entirely different kind of monster. He was a ruthless real estate tycoon who had spent his entire adult life bullying, bribing, and crushing anyone who stood in his way. His massive, narcissistic ego simply could not process defeat. He could not accept that the stepdaughter he had physically and emotionally abused for a decade held absolute power over his fate. The shock on Vaughn's face rapidly morphed into a twisted, psychotic rage. The thick veins in his neck bulged against his collar. He refused to lose to me. He refused to surrender his empire to a woman he considered completely beneath him. Vaughn reached violently into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a folded piece of heavy parchment paper. It was his personal duplicate copy of the durable power of attorney, the exact same document I had found upstairs next to my mother's sedated body. He whipped it open, his hands shaking with furious adrenaline. The dark smear of my mother's blood was clearly visible next to her forced signature, proving she had fiercely resisted signing both copies before the sedatives took hold. "I do not care if you are the President of the United States!" Vaughn snarled, his voice vibrating with desperate venom. He waved the bloodied document in the air, brandishing it like a shield. "This signature is legally binding. Diane signed it in front of witnesses. The trust is mine. You have absolutely no jurisdiction over private family finances, Colonel." Vaughn spun around wildly, locking his bloodshot eyes on his son-in-law. Dayon was still paralyzed by fear, gripping his wife's arm and staring at me. Dion Vaughn screamed, spraying saliva across the marble floor. "Execute the wire transfer to the Caymans right now. Move the 50 million. Do it before she locks us out." Dion snapped out of his terrified paralysis the moment Vaughn barked the order. The promise of $50 million was a powerful motivator, overriding every survival instinct in his body. He released Sloane's arm and sprinted toward the massive marble kitchen island where his sleek silver laptop sat open next to a platter of expensive cheeses. His custom leather shoes slipped frantically on the spilled wine, but he managed to catch his balance and slam his hands onto the keyboard. Sweat poured down his forehead, ruining his perfectly groomed appearance. His fingers flew across the keys with desperate speed. As an investment banker managing high-yield portfolios, Dion understood the intricate mechanics of international finance better than anyone else in the room. He knew exactly how the offshore routing systems worked. If he could authorize the digital transfer and push the funds past the domestic banking gateways, the $50 million would disperse into a decentralized labyrinth of Cayman Islands shell companies. Once the money crossed international borders, it became a ghost. He knew that even a high-ranking military commander would need international warrants and months of bureaucratic red tape to trace the funds. It was his only ticket out of this nightmare. It was his golden parachute. Sloane rushed to his side, hovering over his shoulder. She gripped the edge of the marble island, her perfectly manicured nails tapping frantically against the stone. "Hurry, Dion," she urged, her voice shrill and desperate. "Just press send and we can leave. We can get on a private flight tonight." Vaughn stood in the foyer, still clutching the bloodied legal document. A manic, victorious laugh erupted from his chest. He genuinely believed his wealth and his lawyers could shield him from the consequences of tonight. He thought he had outsmarted a federal military operation, using nothing but a forced signature and an internet connection. Dion logged into his highly secured banking portal, bypassing the two-factor authentication protocols with trembling hands. As the dashboard loaded, displaying the massive stolen trust fund balance, his confidence suddenly returned. The glowing numbers on the screen restored his massive ego. Behind a keyboard, he felt invincible again. He was in his element. The polished, arrogant finance mogul resurfaced, masking the terrified man who had cowered just moments ago. He looked up from the screen and locked eyes with me across the room. A greasy, defiant smirk stretched across his face. "You might have an army backing you up, Blair." Dion shouted, his fingers preparing to execute the final authorization command. "But you are out of your jurisdiction here. This is private wealth management. You have guns and tactical gear, but I have a Wharton degree. I move capital for a living. I know loopholes your government hackers do not even know exist." He hit the return key, submitting the final clearance codes to initiate the mass transfer. The loading icon appeared on his screen, spinning in a bright blue circle as the banking servers processed the massive $50 million request. "Money moves faster than bullets," Colonel Dion sneered, dripping with condescension. "By the time your people figure out what gateway I used, this cash will be completely untraceable. You lose." The wealthy investors remaining in the room held their breath, waiting for my reaction. They expected me to charge across the room. They expected me to tackle Dion to the floor or point my weapon at his head and demand he cancel the transfer. They expected panic. I gave them absolutely nothing. I did not unholster my Glock. I did not take a single step toward the kitchen island. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of concern. I simply stood there, bathed in the warm light of the crystal chandeliers, holding my ground with perfect military discipline. Letting an arrogant enemy believe they have secured a victory is the most effective way to shatter them completely. I unzipped the heavy waterproof pouch on the chest of my tactical vest. I reached inside and pulled out a ruggedized military-grade tablet. The casing was thick, matte black carbon fiber designed to withstand combat drops and extreme temperatures. The screen was already active, glowing with lines of dense encrypted code streaming across a dark interface. I held the tablet in my left hand. I did not look at Vaughn. I did not look at Sloane. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on Dion, watching the desperate hope radiating from his sweating face as he waited for the transaction-approved message to appear on his laptop. I raised my right hand and hovered my index finger directly over the glowing red command prompt on my tablet screen. I did not say a word. I simply tapped the glass once. The blue spinning loading circle on Dion's laptop screen suddenly stuttered. It froze completely mid-rotation. A harsh mechanical buzz erupted from the internal speakers of his sleek silver machine. The pristine white interface of his offshore banking portal warped, fracturing into jagged lines of distorted pixels. Dion slammed his palm against the side of the laptop. He furiously punched the escape key, his eyes wide with frantic urgency. "The network is dropping!" Dion yelled, his voice cracking. "Sloane, go check the main fiber optic router. Do it right now." Sloane did not move. She was too terrified of the energy shifting in the room to take a single step. She just stood there, gripping the edge of the marble island, staring blankly at the glitching screen. I lowered my tactical tablet and slid it back into the waterproof pouch on my chest rig. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the massive kitchen island. The heavy thud of my combat boots echoed through the grand living room. The wealthy investors backed away, pressing themselves against the walls, giving me a wide, unobstructed path to my target. "You really think a Wharton degree means anything in my world, Dion?" I asked, my voice cutting through his rising panic like a serrated blade. "You move capital for spoiled billionaires trying to dodge federal taxes. You play with algorithms designed by banking interns." I took another slow step, closing the distance. "I command the Joint Cyber Warfare Task Force." I continued, locking my eyes onto his sweating face. "While you and my stepsister were flying first class to Aspen and charging $50,000 shopping sprees in Paris to my mother's stolen credit lines, I was hunting shadow money in active war zones. I spend my days dismantling international terror financing networks. I crack syndicates that move billions of dollars through the dark web to fund illicit weapons trades. Your little Cayman Islands routing system is a textbook amateur move. It is a child playing with a piggy bank." Dion ignored me, his fingers flying across his keyboard as he tried to force a manual override. He opened a command terminal, his eyes darting across the screen as he typed in desperate backup codes. The polished African-American finance mogul who loved to flaunt his wealth and mock my modest paycheck was completely unraveling. His expensive suit was soaked with nervous sweat. "You cannot stop a hardwired batch transfer," Dion muttered, his voice trembling as he tried to convince himself. "The protocol is already inside the banking gateway. It is untouchable." "Is it untouchable, Dion?" I asked, stopping just a few feet away from the marble island. "Let us talk about your untouchable assets." I did not look at any notes. I did not need to check my tablet. I had memorized their entire fraudulent empire down to the very last decimal point. "Let us talk about the offshore account ending in 4729 at the Grand Cayman National Bank," I said, my voice projecting clearly so every single wealthy investor in the room could hear me. "The one registered under your fake shell company, Apex Global Holdings." Dion froze. His hands stopped typing. He slowly looked up from his screen, his eyes wide with absolute horror. "Or maybe we should talk about Vaughn's hidden real estate escrow accounts in Cyprus." I continued, shifting my gaze to my stepfather, who was still standing frozen in the foyer. "Account number 8810, the one he uses to funnel bribe money to local zoning officials. Or the private Swiss vault you opened last year under Sloane's maiden name to hide the cash you embezzled from your own investment firm clients." Gasps erupted from the crowd of investors. A few of the men in expensive suits immediately pulled out their cell phones, stepping away from Vaughn and Dion as if they were suddenly radioactive. They were Dion's clients. They had just realized their trusted financial advisor was stealing from them to fund his wife's designer lifestyle. The brilliant business facade they had constructed to scam their social circle was burning to the ground in real time. Vaughn's face turned a sickening shade of gray. The bloodied power of attorney slipped from his trembling fingers and fluttered to the marble floor, landing near my wet combat boots. "How do you know those numbers?" Dion choked out, his polished persona completely destroyed. "Those ledgers are encrypted behind military-grade firewalls." "I am the military-grade firewall, Dion," I said, leaning forward slightly and placing both my hands flat on the marble island. "I have had full root access to your entire financial network for 8 months. I have watched every single transaction, every stolen dollar, every forged expense report. I saw it all." I watched the realization hit him, crushing the air right out of his lungs. "I could have shut you down months ago," I explained, my tone completely merciless. "But if I just arrested you for embezzlement, you would have hired expensive corporate lawyers. You would have tied up my mother's assets in civil court for a decade, claiming it was all a simple accounting error. I needed a clean kill. I needed you to commit a definitive, undeniable federal crime. I needed you to attempt a wire fraud of massive proportions across international borders using an extorted signature." I smiled, a cold, predatory expression that made him flinch backward. "I needed you to pull the trigger, Dion. And you just did." At that exact second, a deafening digital screech blasted from Dion's laptop. The screen flashed violently, casting a harsh red glow across his sweating face. The banking interface completely dissolved. In its place, a massive black window appeared displaying a single glowing red text box. Fatal error. Unauthorized access protocol. Network severed. Dion grabbed the edges of the laptop, his knuckles turning stark white. He hammered the keyboard, frantically hitting the enter key over and over again, but the machine was completely dead. The red glow illuminated the absolute despair in his eyes. What did you do? What did I do? Dion? I repeated his panicked question, letting the words hang in the heavy air of the grand living room. I did exactly what I was trained to do. I executed a localized malware payload directly into your internal network. I used my military clearance to trigger a Title X cyber directive. That $50 million you tried to steal from my mother did not go to the Cayman Islands. It was intercepted by a federal gateway and diverted straight into a secured digital evidentiary vault at Fort Meade. You just handed the Department of Defense the exact forensic trail they need to prosecute you. Dayon stared at the glowing red screen, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He pressed his hands against his temples, his polished Ivy League finance persona completely disintegrating. He looked like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had already snapped shut around his neck. But I was not finished. I did not just come here to stop one single transaction. I came here to burn your entire world to the ground. I turned my gaze back to the foyer, where Vaughn was still standing frozen over the dropped power of attorney document. Vaughn, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room. You love your real estate empire. You love telling everyone how you built it from the ground up. Well, I just tore it down. My cyber team executed a hard freeze on every single one of your corporate holdings. Vaughn shook his head, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. You cannot do that, he whispered weakly. You do not have the authority. I have absolute authority, I corrected him sharply. Your commercial leases, your property management ledgers, your offshore slush funds, they are all locked down under the Patriot Act, pending a federal investigation into international money laundering. Your credit cards will be declined. Your bank accounts are inaccessible. You cannot even buy a cup of coffee tomorrow morning, Vaughn. You are completely bankrupt. Vaughn staggered backward, hitting the wall of the foyer. The billionaire tyrant was suddenly a penniless old man. His knees buckled slightly, and he slid down the expensive wallpaper, staring blankly at the floor. I slowly shifted my attention to Sloane. My stepsister was trembling violently. She was clinging to the marble kitchen island, her perfectly styled hair falling across her sweaty face. She looked from her father to her husband, waiting for one of the powerful men in her life to fix this nightmare. She had spent her entire adult life believing she was untouchable royalty. She expected Dion to laugh and tell her this was all a sick joke, but Dion could not even look at her. Sloane, I said, taking a slow step toward her. You spent the last 2 years putting on a spectacular show for social media. You loved playing the role of the glamorous, wealthy wife. You loved looking down on me because I did not wear designer labels. I pointed at the glittering diamond watch on her left wrist. Let us talk about your fabulous lifestyle, Sloane. Let us talk about that watch. $240,000. Dion bought that for your anniversary last month. Did he tell you he purchased it using capital he drained directly from the college funds of 3 different clients? Sloane gasped and instinctively grabbed her wrist as if the diamonds had suddenly turned to hot coals. No, she whimpered, looking at Dion. No, Dion, tell her she is lying. Dion kept his head down, staring at his ruined laptop. He shrank away from her touch. I did not let up. I kept pushing, dismantling her fabricated reality piece by piece. What about the luxury villa you rented in Tuscany for 6 weeks last summer? I continued, my voice echoing relentlessly. $180,000. That came straight out of the pension fund of a retired couple who trusted your brilliant husband to manage their life savings. Your custom sports car, your massive designer shoe collection, your weekly trips to the high-end medical spas. All of it funded by wire fraud. Sloane began to hyperventilate. The horrifying truth was crashing down on her all at once. The perfect rich husband she loved to show off was nothing but a cheap thief. He had not made a legitimate profit at his investment firm in 3 years. He had been running a glorified Ponzi scheme, desperately shuffling stolen client funds just to keep her happy and maintain their fake status. "You are wearing stolen money, Sloan," I said, my tone completely merciless. "You are an accessory to federal crimes. You are just as bankrupt and pathetic as the men you rely on. You have absolutely nothing." The wealthy investors remaining in the room suddenly erupted into a frenzy. These were Dion's clients, the very people he had been stealing from to buy Sloane's jewelry and fund Vaughn's corrupt ventures. Several men in expensive suits lunged forward, shouting furiously at Dion, demanding to know where their money was. They realized they had just been sitting in the living room of the man who robbed them, blind drinking expensive wine, paid for with their own stolen assets. Dion backed away from the angry crowd, raising his hands defensively. He bumped hard against the marble island, trapped between his furious clients and the glowing red screen of his destroyed laptop. The suave, confident financial director was gone, replaced by a trembling coward. Then a sharp electronic sound pierced through the shouting. It was a high-pitched chime. Ping! Dion flinched. The sound came from inside his tailored suit jacket. He slowly reached into his breast pocket with a trembling hand and pulled out his personal smartphone. Ping! Ping! The notifications started arriving in rapid succession. Dion stared at the screen, his eyes widening in absolute terror. The polished African-American finance mogul watched his entire life vanish in a series of digital push notifications. Ping, ping, ping. The phone began to vibrate uncontrollably in his palm. A relentless avalanche of automated alerts flooded his lock screen. The sound was deafening in its implications. It was the sound of a financial empire turning to dust. He swiped frantically, opening his secure banking applications, his fingers slipping on the smooth glass. I stood there watching the final blow land exactly as I had orchestrated it. Every single account balance on his screen dropped to zero. His personal checking account, his corporate expense accounts, his hidden offshore holding funds, all of them collapsing in real time and displaying a massive glaring zero. Dion dropped the phone onto the marble counter. The screen remained lit, displaying the automated message sent from his primary financial institution. The bold text stared back at him, sealing his absolute destruction. It read, "Account balance zeroed out. Access restricted pending federal review by the Department of the Treasury." Dion stared at the glowing screen of his smartphone, his mind completely unable to process the absolute zero displayed across his entire financial existence. He tapped the glass frantically, desperately swiping to refresh the banking application, praying it was merely a visual glitch. The bold notification from the Department of the Treasury remained stubbornly fixed in place. Before he could even attempt to log into a secondary offshore portal, the device vibrated violently in his hand. A high-priority email notification sliced across the top of his screen. The sender address bore the official encrypted routing tags of the United States federal government. The subject line was capitalized in stark black letters. "Official notice of asset seizure and pending indictment." Dion swallowed hard, his throat completely dry. He tapped the notification. The email opened, displaying the prominent, unmistakable seals of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. The legal jargon was dense, but the message was devastatingly clear. He was currently the primary target of an active multi-agency federal probe. I stepped closer to the marble island, resting my hands on my tactical belt. I watched the arrogant, polished finance king read his own digital death warrant. "You thought you were so incredibly smart, Dion," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the terrified whispers of his former clients. "You thought your elite degree and your custom suits made you untouchable. You thought a quiet, obedient administrative worker could never understand the complex mechanics of international wealth management." Dion slowly raised his head. His eyes were bloodshot, swimming with a panic so profound it looked like he was physically drowning. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a ragged, pathetic wheeze escaped his lungs. "Let me explain exactly how you just destroyed your own life," I continued, showing him absolutely zero mercy. "For the past 8 months, my cyber intelligence unit has been building a massive, airtight federal case against your firm. We had all the ledgers. We had all the forged expense reports. We had every single piece of evidence proving you were running a fraudulent Ponzi scheme. But we needed a catalyst. We needed you to execute a crime so blatant and so heavily documented that no expensive corporate defense attorney could ever negotiate a plea deal. I pointed to his ruined laptop, its screen still glowing a harsh, fatal red. The moment you bypassed your two-factor authentication and pressed send on that $50 million wire transfer, you triggered the trap, I explained. My malware payload did not just stop the money. It captured your biometric login, recorded your keystrokes, and logged your specific IP address. It instantly packaged that data and transmitted it directly to the Cybercrimes Division at Quantico. You basically just notarized your own federal confession. Dion began to shake. The fine fabric of his expensive three-piece suit trembled as his body went into severe physiological shock. You did not just attempt to steal from my mother, I said, leaning forward slightly. You crossed international borders with extorted funds. That instantly elevates this from a local white-collar crime to a massive federal offense. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division is already auditing every single account you have ever touched. The FBI is currently drafting the arrest warrants for international money laundering, aggravated wire fraud, and severe felony elder abuse. I paused, letting the devastating reality of those charges settle over the grand living room. The wealthy investors standing nearby gasped, backing even further away from the kitchen island. They were looking at Dion not as a financial advisor, but as a condemned man. Do you know what the federal sentencing guidelines look like for those combined charges, Dion? I asked, my tone dripping with lethal ice. You are not looking at a few months in a minimum security white-collar resort. You are facing 30 to 40 years in a federal penitentiary. You are going to be an old, broken man by the time you ever see the outside of a concrete cell. You are going to lose everything: your firm, your reputation, your freedom. It is all gone. The sheer magnitude of his destruction finally broke him. Dion's knees completely buckled. The polished, arrogant African-American mogul who had spent the last decade mocking my modest paycheck and flaunting his unearned wealth collapsed like a puppet with its strings suddenly cut. He hit the hardwood floor hard, his custom leather shoes slipping wildly in the spilled red wine. He dropped his phone, letting it clatter against the marble base of the kitchen island. He fell to his hands and knees, bowing his head toward the floor. He brought his shaking hands up to his face, clutching his head as he began to hyperventilate. Harsh, jagged gasps tore through his throat. He was actively having a severe panic attack, his chest heaving as his brain desperately tried to find a way out of a trap that had no exit. He was trapped, and he knew it. I stood over him, watching the mighty finance king weep into the Persian rug. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. He was a predator who had preyed on my vulnerable mother, and I had simply introduced him to a much larger predator. Sloane had been standing frozen against the kitchen counters throughout my entire explanation. She had listened to every single word. She had watched the email from the FBI arrive. She had watched the investors, the people who defined her elite social standing, turn away from them in absolute disgust. Sloane looked down at her wrists, staring at the $250,000 diamond watch she now knew was purchased with stolen money. She looked at her designer silk dress. She looked around the opulent, sprawling mansion that was currently locked down by federal authorities. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. There was no secret offshore account. There was no private jet waiting to whisk them away to a non-extradition country. The endless supply of stolen money was permanently shut off. Her entire life of effortless luxury, the glamorous reality she loved to flaunt on social media, was dead. She was about to be the wife of a convicted federal felon, stripped of every asset she owned. The sheer terror on Sloane's face rapidly vanished. The panic dissolved instantly, replaced by a vicious, toxic rage. But she did not direct her fury at me. She knew I was completely untouchable. I was the architect of their destruction, but Dion was the fool who had failed to protect her. Sloane's head snapped downward, her eyes locking onto her husband, who was still weeping on his hands and knees in the spilled wine. Her perfectly manicured hands balled into tight, shaking fists as she stepped aggressively toward him. Sloane marched toward the pathetic heap of a man she called her husband. She did not offer him a hand. She did not offer comfort or solidarity in the face of their mutual destruction. Instead, she drew back her right arm and delivered a vicious, open-handed slap directly across Dion's cheek. The sharp crack of her palm striking his face echoed like a gunshot through the silent living room. Dion reeled backward from the physical impact hitting the base of the marble kitchen island. "You promised me we were safe!" Sloane shrieked, her voice tearing at the seams, destroying her carefully cultivated high society accent. "You looked me in the eyes and promised me those offshore accounts were completely untouchable. You said you were a financial genius. You are nothing but a useless fraud. You let a freeloader secretary destroy our entire life in 5 minutes. You are a pathetic loser." The sheer sting of the physical blow snapped Dion out of his hyperventilating panic. The crushing terror that had him weeping on the floor instantly transmuted into a volatile, highly defensive rage. He scrambled to his feet, his expensive custom-tailored suit dripping with spilled red wine. His face twisted into an ugly, vicious snarl. "Do not you dare put this entirely on me!" Dion roared, pointing a trembling, aggressive finger directly at his wife's face. "You knew exactly where every single dollar came from. You loved spending it. You never once complained when I bought you those diamonds, or paid for your luxury cars with stolen pension funds. You are just as guilty as I am." Dion took a step forward, towering over Sloane, his polished Ivy League facade completely eradicated by raw desperation. "You want to play the innocent victim?" Dion yelled, his deep voice echoing aggressively toward the vaulted ceilings. "You were the one who researched the fake medical records. You were the one who found the corrupt private doctor to diagnose your stepmother with end-stage dementia. You literally handed me the forged medical file yesterday and told me to get the estate transfer done so you could put a cash down payment on that ski lodge in Aspen. You pushed for the heavy sedatives. You happily spent the stolen money every single day." The wealthy investors standing near the walls gasped loudly. The corrupt sheriff and his deputies, who were still standing frozen near the shattered front doors, exchanged panicked, terrified glances. They were actively listening to a full, unprompted verbal confession to a massive federal conspiracy including wire fraud and severe elder abuse. Vaughn realized exactly what was happening. His arrogant billionaire brain finally processed the catastrophic legal disaster unfolding right in his own foyer. He lunged forward, scrambling over the debris, his face purple with absolute rage. "Shut your mouth!" Vaughn bellowed, grabbing Dion violently by the collar of his ruined suit. "Shut your mouth right now, you stupid, arrogant fool! You are confessing to federal crimes in front of the police. You are handing the government our heads on a silver platter." But the fragile alliance of thieves had already reached its absolute breaking point. There was zero loyalty among parasites. When the host dies, the parasites inevitably turn on each other to survive. Dion shoved his father-in-law violently backward. Vaughn stumbled, his expensive leather shoes losing traction on the wet floor as he crashed hard into the side of a heavy leather armchair. "Do not touch me, old man!" Dion spat, his eyes wide and wild with panic. "You orchestrated this entire operation. You dragged me into this because you were too cowardly to steal from your own wife directly. You thought you were the smartest real estate tycoon in the country, but you brought a federal cyber warfare commander right into our living room. You killed us. You killed us all with your massive blind ego." Sloane turned on her father, her face contorted with vicious blame. "He is right!" Sloane shrieked at Vaughn, pointing an accusatory finger. "You promised us the trust fund was an easy target. You said Blair was a weak, pathetic loser who would never fight back. You said we deserved that money. You ruined my life. You ruined everything." The majestic, sophisticated Kingsley family completely imploded. They looked like feral animals trapped in a burning cage, viciously tearing at each other's throats to save themselves. They screamed and shoved, airing every dirty secret, every hidden crime, and every ounce of toxic resentment they had harbored for a decade. The pristine facade of old money and elite status was stripped away, revealing the raw, rotting core of their existence. They threw each other under the bus without a single second of hesitation, trying desperately to shift the federal crosshairs. I stood perfectly still, watching the glorious destruction unfold. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to fire another shot or deploy another line of malicious code. They were doing all the heavy lifting for me, executing their own demise with spectacular efficiency. Sloane looked wildly around the room, breathing heavily. She looked at her husband, who was currently screaming profanities at her father. She looked at the terrified investors who were actively backing away from her, heading toward the exit. She looked at the police officers who were slowly reaching for their radios, realizing they were going to have to make massive arrests just to save their own careers from the incoming federal hammer. Then Sloane looked at me. She saw the cold, absolute control radiating from my posture. She realized that Dion and Vaughn were sinking ships, rapidly descending into the dark abyss of federal prison. She realized that their wealth was gone, their power was erased, and their freedom was expiring by the second. She realized that I was the only person in the entire world who held the authority to stop the automated military audits and the incoming federal indictments. Sloane's survival instinct kicked into overdrive. She completely abandoned her anger. The vicious, screaming woman vanished, replaced instantly by a pathetic, desperate beggar willing to sacrifice every ounce of her dignity. She dropped heavily to her hands and knees. She did not care about her expensive designer silk dress. She did not care that she was crawling through puddles of spilled wine and shattered crystal glass cutting her skin. She dragged herself across the expensive Persian rug, leaving a trail of wet stains behind her. She crawled directly toward me, stopping right at my feet. Sloane reached out with her trembling, manicured hands and desperately grabbed the heavy leather of my combat boots. She looked up at me, her face streaked with ruined makeup and real terrified tears pouring from her eyes. "Blair, please," Sloane sobbed, her voice cracking into a high-pitched wail. "We are sisters. Please, you have to listen to me. I was manipulated. My father and Dion forced me to go along with it. I never wanted to hurt your mother. I love you, Blair. Spare me. Please spare me." I looked down at the weeping woman clutching my boots. There was a time many years ago when I might have felt a shred of pity for her. There was a time when I desperately wanted to be accepted into this family, when I would have done anything to earn a kind word from the golden child. But the military had burned that naive girl away a long time ago. I did not feel pity. I felt absolute unadulterated disgust. I sharply pulled my leg back, kicking my heavy combat boot completely free from her desperate grasp. Sloane lurched forward, her hands hitting the wet marble floor. "Do not ever call me your sister," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, quiet tone that echoed over her pathetic sobbing. "We share absolutely nothing. You built your entire identity on making sure I knew I was beneath you. You spent a decade treating me like a disease you could catch. And now that your fraudulent empire is burning, you want to play the victim." Sloane looked up at me, her mascara running in dark streaks down her face. I did not know she pleaded, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "I swear, Blair, I did not know how they were getting the money. My dad and Dion handled all the finances. I just signed the papers they told me to sign. I am innocent." "You are a terrible liar, Sloane," I said, shaking my head slowly. "And you severely underestimate the surveillance capabilities of the United States government." I reached into the secondary utility pocket of my tactical vest. I pulled out a thick stack of glossy, high-resolution surveillance photographs. I did not hand them to her. I threw them aggressively into the spilled wine and broken glass directly in front of her face. "Look at them," I commanded. Sloane hesitated, her trembling hands hovering over the photographs. She slowly picked up the top image. The photograph was crystal clear, taken from a highly elevated vantage point. It showed Sloane standing inside a wildly expensive boutique on Fifth Avenue. She was holding a massive diamond watch up to the light, throwing her head back in a joyous, vibrant laugh, while a sales associate poured her a glass of premium champagne. "Look at the digital timestamp printed in the bottom right corner," I instructed, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the room. "Read the date and the exact time, Sloane." She stared at the red digital numbers printed on the photograph. Her breathing hitched. "That photograph was taken exactly 4 days ago at 2:15 in the afternoon," I explained, stepping closer to her cowering form. According to the forged medical records Dion just handed to the police, that was the exact same day and the exact same hour your stepmother was supposedly suffering a severe violent episode of end-stage dementia. The records claim she was completely unhinged, requiring immediate emergency sedation and a private doctor to restrain her. I pointed at the photograph in her shaking hands. "You were not weeping over your sick stepmother, Sloane," I said, my tone dripping with absolute contempt. "You were not traumatized by her failing health. You were 200 miles away drinking imported champagne and spending the exact trust fund dollars your husband was actively draining from her accounts. We tracked your cell phone GPS. We pulled the security footage from the boutique. We matched the credit card receipts to the offshore wire transfers." Sloane dropped the photograph. It landed face up in a puddle of dark red wine. She tried to formulate another excuse, to spin another desperate lie, but the irrefutable evidence completely paralyzed her. "You knew exactly what they were doing to her," I continued mercilessly. "You watched them drug my mother. You watched them lock her in a wheelchair. And you happily took the money they stole from her to go buy yourself shiny new toys to show off on the internet." Sloane curled in on herself, wrapping her arms around her knees and burying her face in her chest. She let out a hollow, broken wail. The illusion was entirely shattered. She could not gaslight a federal intelligence officer holding time-stamped photographic evidence of her crimes. "You are not a victim, Sloane," I stated, delivering the final crushing blow to her fragile ego. "You are just a parasite who finally ran out of blood to suck. Enjoy federal prison." I stepped away from her, leaving the broken golden child weeping on the ruined floor. I shifted my tactical focus, scanning the room to assess the remaining hostiles. Dion was still paralyzed near the kitchen island, completely neutralized by his own incoming federal indictments. The wealthy investors were actively slipping out the shattered front doors, desperate to avoid being associated with the colossal crime scene. The corrupt sheriff and his deputies were standing completely still, terrified to make a single move that might draw my attention back to them. But my eyes immediately locked onto Vaughn Kingsley. The arrogant billionaire real estate tycoon was standing perfectly still near the archway of the grand dining room. He was not screaming anymore. He was not threatening to sue me or demanding the police arrest me. The loud, booming patriarch had gone completely silent. I watched the devastating reality wash over his face. He looked at his weeping daughter crawling on the floor. He looked at his son-in-law hyperventilating near the ruined laptop. He looked at the flashing red and blue police lights illuminating the snow outside his shattered front doors. He processed the absolute certainty that his wealth was frozen, his reputation was annihilated, and he was going to spend the rest of his natural life locked inside a concrete federal cell. He had lost everything. His empire was dead. I watched his eyes change. The furious, arrogant fire that had burned in his gaze for a decade suddenly extinguished. His eyes went completely dark, hollow, and terrifyingly dead. He was no longer a wealthy businessman trying to protect his assets. He was a cornered rat who realized there was absolutely no way out of the trap. When a narcissist loses complete control of their reality, they do not simply surrender. They seek to inflict as much catastrophic damage as possible before they go down. Vaughn slowly turned his head. His dead, hollow eyes locked onto a heavy antique mahogany table sitting in the hallway just a few feet to his right. I knew exactly what was inside that table. I had memorized the architectural blueprints and the security logs of this entire estate before I ever breached the front gates. Vaughn let out a low, guttural snarl that sounded entirely inhuman. He shoved off the wall and lunged desperately toward the hallway table, reaching wildly for the hidden drawer. Vaughn lunged desperately toward the hallway table, reaching wildly for the hidden drawer. His expensive leather shoes scrambled for traction against the slick marble floor. He ripped the heavy brass handle with such frantic brute force that the wood splintered sharply. His hand plunged deep into the dark compartment. When he spun back around, the polished silver finish of a snub-nosed .38 caliber revolver gleamed dangerously under the crystal chandeliers. The heavy metallic click of the hammer being cocked backward echoed like a sonic boom across the silent foyer. The corrupt sheriff and his remaining deputies completely froze. These were men used to intimidating unarmed civilians and taking bribes from wealthy socialites in quiet country club backrooms. Faced with a genuinely unhinged billionaire brandishing a loaded firearm, their cowardice took over instantly. Sheriff Tate took a rapid, stumbling step backward, raising his empty hands in a pathetic display of surrender. He did not draw his service weapon. He did not shout a single tactical command. He was absolutely terrified to engage an active shooter. His deputies followed his lead, shrinking back against the shattered front doors, desperately trying to stay out of the line of fire. Vaughn did not aim the revolver at the cowardly police officers. He did not even aim it at me. He was a ruthless predator, and he knew exactly how to inflict the most catastrophic psychological damage possible. He spun around and sprinted up the first flight of the grand staircase, taking the steps two at a time. My mother had somehow managed to drag herself out of the master suite, fighting against the heavy dose of medical-grade sedatives pumping through her veins. She was gripping the ornate wooden banister, her legs trembling violently as she tried to make her way down to me. Her silk nightgown was torn and her eyes were barely open. Vaughn reached her in 3 violent strides. He reached out with his large free hand and grabbed a thick handful of her hair, yanking her backward with sickening force. Diane let out a weak, ragged cry of pain as her knees gave out completely. Vaughn hauled her semi-conscious body tight against his chest, using his own wife as a human shield. He jammed the short steel barrel of the revolver directly against her right temple. The cold metal pressed ruthlessly into her pale skin, leaving a deep red indentation. He wrapped his thick forearm tightly around her neck, choking off her air supply. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated madness. The polished, sophisticated real estate tycoon was completely gone, replaced by a rabid, desperate animal. "You think you can take everything from me?" Vaughn roared, his voice vibrating with absolute psychotic rage. The sound tore through the mansion, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings. "I built this family from the ground up. I gave this pathetic woman a life of luxury when she was nothing but a broke single mother living in a dump. She owes me everything. She owes me her very existence." He pressed the barrel harder against her temple, making Diane wince in agony. She tried to lift her weak hands to pry his arm away from her throat, but her drug-addled muscles completely refused to cooperate. "You think your federal badges and your military cyber commands make you a god, Blair?" he screamed, saliva flying from his lips. "You walked in here and destroyed my empire. You took my money. You humiliated me in front of my peers. But you do not control me. If I am going to a concrete federal cell for the rest of my life, I am absolutely not going alone. If I am going to hell, I am taking her right down to the flames with me." I stood frozen at the base of the staircase, my mind shifting instantly into hyper-focused tactical combat processing. Time seemed to slow to an absolute crawl. I calculated the physical distance between us. It was exactly 14 feet and an elevation change of 6 steps. In a tactical scenario, 14 feet against an armed hostile actively holding a human shield is a highly lethal gap. Closing that distance without a firearm before his finger twitched on the trigger was mathematically impossible. I analyzed his posture. His grip on the revolver was tight, his knuckles stark white. His trigger discipline was non-existent. His index finger was resting heavily right on the curved metal of the trigger. A single sudden movement, a loud noise, or a sudden spasm of his own panicked nervous system would cause the gun to discharge directly into my mother's skull. I reached down towards my right thigh where I normally kept a backup tactical combat blade, but my fingers brushed against empty fabric. I had left the blade secured in the armory locker during the frantic scramble to leave the base. I gripped the heavy carbon fiber military tablet in my left hand, but tossing a computer at an armed hostage taker was a desperate fool's gamble. I let the heavy military-grade tablet slip from my fingers. It hit the marble floor with a loud, sharp crack, the screen facing down in a puddle of spilled wine. I instinctively reached for the tactical holster on my right hip, my muscle memory taking over. My fingers grasped nothing but empty air and tough nylon fabric. My custom Glock 19 was not there. It was still sitting on the carpet near the top of the stairs, exactly where I had surrendered it to the corrupt deputies earlier that evening, when I was playing the role of the compliant victim. I was completely unarmed. The most highly trained Special Forces intelligence commander in the room had absolutely no weapon to draw. I took a slow, steady breath, forcing my heart rate to decelerate. Panic kills faster than bullets, and I could not afford to let Vaughn see a single ounce of fear in my eyes. I raised my empty hands slowly into the cold air, keeping my palms open and entirely visible. I tilted my chin up, locking my gaze onto the deranged billionaire. I stared straight down the dark, hollow barrel of Vaughn Kingsley's revolver. I stood perfectly still at the base of the staircase, keeping my empty hands raised in the freezing air of the ruined foyer. I held his frantic gaze, refusing to blink. The silence in the mansion was absolute, broken only by my mother's ragged breathing and the distant howl of the blizzard ripping through the shattered front doors. I am a highly trained intelligence officer. When you are stripped of your tactical gear and your sidearm, your mind becomes the primary weapon. I bypassed his physical threat and aimed directly at his psychological vulnerabilities. In advanced hostage negotiations, you must identify the captor's core motivation to manipulate their next physical movement. Vaughn Kingsley was a malignant narcissist. His entire identity rested on absolute power, total control, and the unshakable perception of invincibility. He did not care about the money as much as he cared about the elevated status and fear the money provided him. I needed to weaponize that vanity. I needed to make him realize that pulling the trigger would not restore his dominance, but rather cement his ultimate humiliation. "You look absolutely pathetic, Vaughn," I said, my voice carrying a steady rhythmic cadence deliberately designed to penetrate his panicked state. A billionaire real estate tycoon hiding behind a heavily sedated woman because he is too terrified to face the consequences of his own sloppy mistakes. He pressed the barrel harder against Diane's head, causing her to whimper in a drug-induced haze. "Shut your mouth," he spat, spraying saliva over the polished wooden banister. "I am in control here. I make the decisions. I decide who lives and who dies tonight." "You control absolutely nothing," I countered smoothly, taking a deliberate, microscopic half-step forward to draw his focus entirely onto me. "Look around you, Vaughn. Look at the burning ruins of your pathetic life. Your investors fled the moment they realized you were a fraud. Your polished son-in-law betrayed you to save his own skin and is currently weeping on the floor. Your golden daughter is crawling in spilled wine like a ruined child. Your offshore accounts are currently being seized by the Department of the Treasury. You have zero leverage. You have zero allies." He gritted his teeth, his hand shaking violently against my mother's hair. "I will kill her. I swear to God. I will blow her brains out right in front of you and make you watch." "And then what?" I asked, tilting my head slightly, adopting an expression of clinical boredom. "Pulling that trigger does not make you powerful, Vaughn. It just makes you a federal inmate with a capital murder charge. Do you have any idea what happens to soft, pampered, white-collar criminals in a federal supermax facility?" I lowered the pitch of my voice, ensuring every single word hit his fragile ego like a physical strike. I painted a vivid, horrifying picture of his immediate future to shatter any remaining illusion of grandeur he possessed. "There are no private golf courses in federal prison, Vaughn. There are no expensive tailored suits or imported wines or sycophantic local politicians waiting to kiss your ring. You are going to be locked in an 8x10 concrete box for 23 hours a day. You are a weak old man who has never fought a real physical battle in his entire life. You simply pay private security contractors to be tough for you. The inmates in those maximum security facilities will smell your rich entitlement the second you step off the transport bus. You will be stripped, searched, degraded, and treated like absolute garbage. A wealthy, soft real estate mogul like you will not survive a single week in general population. You will be nothing but a target." The sweat beaded heavily on his forehead, tracking down his flushed face and soaking into his expensive silk collar. The heavy silver revolver trembled erratically in his grip. He was breathing heavily, the reality of his impending doom suffocating him. His mind was fracturing under the immense weight of the psychological pressure I was applying. I leaned into the verbal assault, pushing him aggressively toward the absolute breaking point. And the absolute best part of all of this, I said, allowing a cold, mocking smile to touch my lips, is knowing exactly who put you in that concrete cell. I took another calculated fraction of a step forward, locking my eyes onto his bloodshot, panicked gaze, ensuring I was the only thing he could see. For 10 years, you called me a freeloader. You called me an invisible loser who pushed paper for a boring government bureaucracy. You mocked my clothes and my salary at every dinner party. You told your elite social circle I was a tragic, pathetic failure. You paraded around this ridiculous mansion acting like you were a god among men. But the failure completely destroyed your entire global empire in less than 20 minutes. I did not even need my tactical team to break you. I walked into your heavily fortified mansion and erased your life's work while you stood there watching helplessly. Vaughn let out a ragged, desperate gasp. His chest heaved erratically as his lungs demanded more oxygen. The brilliant, untouchable Vaughn Kingsley was absolutely dismantled by the quiet stepdaughter he treated like garbage. I continued driving the final verbal nail into his coffin. You were beaten by a girl, Vaughn. You were outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and utterly crushed by a woman you deemed unworthy to breathe your air. The entire financial world is going to read the federal indictment tomorrow morning. They are going to laugh at you. You will go down in history as the arrogant billionaire who lost everything to the administrative secretary he bullied. The psychological payload detonated inside his mind with catastrophic force. I watched the remaining shreds of his sanity shatter completely. His massive, fragile ego simply could not process the overwhelming humiliation of being defeated by the person he despised the most. The veins in his neck pulsed dangerously against his skin. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated madness. You want to pull the trigger, Vaughn. I challenged, my voice dropping to a lethal, hypnotic whisper. You want to prove to everyone that you are a strong, ruthless man. But shooting a drugged, defenseless woman only proves you are exactly what I said you are. A pathetic coward. If you really want to take back your power, you need to aim at the person who actually destroyed you. You need to aim at the architect of your ruin. You need to aim at me. The provocation worked flawlessly. The toxic cocktail of wounded pride and pure madness boiled over. Vaughn let out a deafening, agonized scream of pure rage that tore through the ruined foyer. He violently shoved my mother aside, sending her crumbling weakly against the wooden banister, sliding safely out of the immediate line of fire. He snapped his right arm outward, ripping the snub-nosed revolver away from her temple. He whipped the heavy steel barrel around, pointing the dark muzzle squarely at the center of my chest. His wild, dead eyes locked onto mine as his finger tightened aggressively around the trigger. His wild, dead eyes locked onto mine as his finger tightened aggressively around the trigger. In close quarters, combat action only beats reaction if the reaction is already in forward motion. The absolute fraction of a second, the heavy steel barrel drifted away from my mother's temple and swung toward my chest. I was already moving. I dropped my center of gravity and exploded upward off the marble floor, pushing through the balls of my combat boots with every ounce of kinetic energy my body possessed. Vaughn expected me to flinch. He expected me to cower, raise my hands defensively, or scream for my life like the soft civilian victims he was so used to bullying. I did the exact opposite. I charged directly into the line of fire. The heavy double-action trigger broke under the pressure of his index finger. The cylinder rotated rapidly, aligning the firing pin, but I was already inside his physical guard. I brought my left forearm up in a vicious sweeping block, violently striking the outside of his right wrist. The sheer force of my upward deflection redirected the barrel of the revolver sharply toward the ceiling an instant before the firing pin struck the primer. A deafening roar erupted inside the confined space of the stairwell. The muzzle flash illuminated his terrified face in a harsh, brilliant yellow light. A .38 caliber hollow-point bullet tore blindly into the vaulted ceiling above us, shattering the expensive plaster and sending a thick shower of white dust and debris raining down over our heads. The concussive wave made my ears ring, but I did not stop moving for a single microsecond. With his arm forcefully extended and the weapon pointing harmlessly upward, I transitioned seamlessly into a brutal armbar takedown. I grabbed his wrist with my right hand, locking my fingers securely around the thick meat of his thumb while hooking my left arm tightly over the top of his extended elbow. I twisted my hips aggressively, pivoting my core and applying maximum downward torque against the natural mechanical limits of his joint. Vaughn was a man who had spent his entire adult life sitting comfortably behind custom mahogany desks, ordering other people to do his dirty work. His body was entirely unprepared for military-grade violence. The bones and ligaments in his arm yielded instantly under the immense, relentless pressure of my leverage. A loud, sharp snap echoed through the dust-filled foyer as his wrist shattered completely. Vaughn let out an agonizing, high-pitched scream that ripped through his vocal cords. His fingers involuntarily released their grip, allowing the heavy silver revolver to drop from his hand and clatter harmlessly down the wooden stairs. I did not let go of his broken arm. I used his own forward momentum and intense pain compliance to drive his body violently down into the hardwood steps. His knees buckled and he crashed face first into the stairs, the air rushing out of his lungs in a heavy, desperate wheeze. I pinned his shattered arm securely behind his back, pressing my knee aggressively into his spine directly between his shoulder blades to ensure he could not move a single muscle. "You spent your whole life buying power, Vaughn," I whispered, my voice cold and steady, directly into his ear, as he sobbed pathetically into the carpet. "You paid people to build your tall buildings, and you paid private security to intimidate your enemies. But out here in the real world, where money cannot shield you from the consequences of your own actions, you are absolutely nothing. You are just a weak, broken old man who brought a stolen gun to a tactical operation." I kept him pinned firmly against the floorboards, my breathing controlled and perfectly even. Before Vaughn could even attempt to form a coherent response to his agonizing physical and mental defeat, a new sound began to vibrate through the thick walls of the sprawling estate. It started as a low, rhythmic thrumming deep in the distance, shaking the shattered glass on the marble floor below. Within seconds, the sound escalated into a deafening mechanical roar. Helicopters. Heavy twin-rotor military-grade transport helicopters. The intense, aggressive downdraft from the massive blades whipped the blizzard outside into a violent, swirling frenzy. The sheer acoustic force rattled the crystal chandeliers overhead, making the pristine glass droplets clink frantically against each other. The corrupt sheriff and his deputies, who were still cowering near the ruined entryway, dropped flat to the floor, covering their heads in absolute panic. They knew exactly what that sound meant. Local law enforcement did not fly heavy armored air support through blinding winter storms. The federal hammer had officially arrived. The massive front windows of the grand living room exploded inward in a spectacular shower of tempered glass and splintered wood. Heavily armored tactical operatives clad in solid black ballistic gear poured through the breached access points. They moved with terrifying synchronized efficiency, their heavy combat boots crushing the debris as they swarmed the mansion. The shattered oak front doors were kicked entirely off their remaining hinges as a second wave of federal agents flooded the grand foyer. The dark room was instantly illuminated by the blinding white beams of tactical flashlights mounted to the barrels of short-barreled assault rifles. Brilliant red and green targeting lasers sliced rapidly through the lingering gun smoke and plaster dust, painting the chests of every single hostile in the room. Dayon screamed and threw his hands over his head as 3 federal agents tackled him aggressively to the marble floor, securing his wrists with heavy industrial zip ties. Sloane simply curled into a pathetic, trembling ball near the kitchen island, weeping hysterically as the tactical operators secured the perimeter and placed her under immediate federal arrest. Clear voices shouted, overlapping in disciplined military cadence. "Main floor secure, hostiles contained." I did not look at the agents swarming the ruined billionaires. I kept my knee firmly planted in Vaughn's spine, my eyes locked on the top of the stairs where my mother lay slumped against the wooden banister, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Through the sea of black tactical armor, a specialized unit of military combat medics burst through the front entrance. They carried heavy trauma bags and portable oxygen units, their eyes scanning the absolute chaos for their primary objective. The tactical operators formed a protective wall securing the perimeter. while the team of medics rushed past the broken bodies of my enemies, charging directly up the grand staircase toward my mother. The lead combat medic reached my mother, checking her vitals and immediately administering the precise reversal agents required to neutralize the heavy sedatives. Two heavily armored federal agents hauled Vaughn up from the floor, dragging his broken body down the wooden stairs. He did not look at me. The arrogant billionaire was completely hollowed out, reduced to a trembling prisoner whose entire empire had been dismantled in a matter of minutes. I watched the tactical teams clear the rest of the expansive estate before allowing the medical personnel to safely load my mother onto a transport stretcher. I finally released my combat stance, rolling my shoulders back and taking a deep breath of the cold winter air flooding through the broken doors. The mission was an absolute success. 6 months later, the harsh freezing blizzard of January had given way to a brilliant warm July morning. I stood on the massive stone balcony of the sprawling estate, overlooking the calm blue waters of the private lake below. The mansion no longer belonged to a tyrannical real estate mogul who used his wealth to manipulate and abuse. Through aggressive federal asset forfeiture laws and my own military legal counsel, we had systematically seized every single brick of the property. The deed was now registered exclusively under one name, Diane. Through the open French doors leading into the master suite, the crisp professional voice of a national news anchor echoed from a flat-screen television mounted on the wall. The high-profile trial that had captivated the financial and real estate worlds for months was officially over. I listened calmly as the anchor detailed the final federal sentencing. Vaughn Kingsley, the former real estate titan, was sentenced to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. The judge showed zero leniency, citing his absolute lack of remorse and his violent attempt to use his wife as a human shield. His son-in-law, Dion, received a 15-year sentence for international wire fraud, massive embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse. Sloane, the former socialite who wept openly in the courtroom begging the judge for mercy, was handed a 10-year sentence for her direct complicity in financial crimes and the deliberate medical exploitation of her stepmother. They were stripped of every stolen dollar, every luxury vehicle, and every ounce of their fabricated dignity. They traded their tailored suits and designer dresses for standard-issue orange jumpsuits. The sound of light, steady footsteps approached from inside the bedroom. I turned away from the balcony railing. My mother walked toward me carrying two steaming ceramic mugs of fresh coffee. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The frail, heavily drugged woman strapped to a medical wheelchair was completely gone. In her place stood a vibrant, healthy woman whose eyes were sharp, clear, and entirely free of the heavy chemical fog Vaughn had forced upon her. She wore a simple, elegant summer dress, her posture straight and confident. We had spent the last 6 months working through intense physical therapy and psychological trauma recovery, but she had fought back with a fierce, relentless resilience that proved exactly where I inherited my own tactical endurance. She handed me a mug, her warm fingers brushing against mine. She looked out over the sprawling green lawn, the exact same lawn where federal agents had dragged her abusers away in heavy steel handcuffs. She took a slow, peaceful sip of her coffee and smiled. It was a genuine, deeply relaxed smile. We did not need to speak about the trial or the federal sentences. The television broadcast had said everything that needed to be said. The nightmare was permanently eradicated. I took a sip of the dark roast coffee, feeling the warm morning breeze against my uniform. Today, I was not wearing my black tactical field jacket or my heavy combat boots. I was dressed in my Class A military uniform. The dark navy fabric was perfectly pressed, the polished brass buttons gleaming brightly in the summer sunlight. The left side of my chest bore the heavy weight of my service ribbons and high-level commendations, a silent, undeniable testament to the years I spent hunting global threats while my family mocked my supposedly boring administrative job. My mother reached out and gently adjusted the silver eagle insignia pinned to my collar, her eyes shining with absolute unadulterated pride. She did not need to use words to tell me how much she valued my strength. Her bright, clear eyes communicated a lifetime of gratitude. The peaceful morning silence was suddenly interrupted by a sharp, distinct vibration. My highly secured government phone rested on the small glass patio table between us. The screen illuminated immediately, displaying a highly encrypted military routing code. It was an automated ping from the subterranean cyber command center in Virginia. Specialist Carter had a new high-value target locked on the tactical grid, a new international mission objective requiring immediate commander authorization to initiate the strike protocol. I set my coffee mug down on the glass table. I looked at my mother and she gave me a slow, understanding nod. She knew exactly what that encrypted alert meant. She knew her daughter was not just a survivor, but a relentless protector standing firmly on the front lines of digital warfare. I picked up the device, my thumb resting lightly over the biometric scanner, preparing to dive right back into the shadows to hunt the next predator. They thought my silence meant I was weak. They didn't realize that you never hear the sniper's bullet until it's already torn right through you. A profound lesson from these stories is that your self-worth is never defined by people who fail to recognize it. We often exhaust ourselves trying to earn the conditional love of toxic relatives, mistaking their rejection for our own inadequacy. However, true strength lies in walking away from environments that diminish us. By redirecting that energy into building our own lives, passions, and chosen families, we transform betrayal into profound personal triumph. Blood may connect us, but genuine respect is what actually makes a family. Have you ever had to walk away to find your true worth? Share your journey and comment below.